Greetings and salutations. Today's video will be my interpretations on acetabular-femoral internal rotation as viewed through the lens of the Postural Restoration Institute. For your information, my views do not represent that of the Institute. These are my own. All that being said, now the idea for this video came about when I was thinking about the difference between AFIR versus innominate triplanar internal rotation. What I mean by the latter is when a inlet is adducting in the femoral plane, internally rotating in the transverse plane, and extending in the sagittal plane. I quickly realized those two phenomenons, meaning the three things that I just described at the same time, and AFIR are not the same thing. At least from my interpretation, they were the same thing. What I mean by that is when the innominate internally rotates in all three planes, meaning inlet, adduction, internal rotation, and extension, if we analyze that separately without the common kinematic relationships that would come about at the femur, it would separate the anterior acetabular rim with the anterior femoral neck. You would have to do something else for that to not happen, meaning FAIR. But nevertheless, that's not AFIR. That would be iliopubal internal rotation plus FAIR. That's not the same thing as AFIR. So I started looking at, okay, so what happens, what needs to happen for you to get AFIR? So let me do this thing. So my interpretation of myokinematic restoration material is that anterior fibers of glute med will get you internal rotation. Well, from my perspective, that seems to be quite tall of an order for something so small, especially when you consider the two bones that this thing is moving. Those are linked to some heavy stuff. You got the trunk on one end, you got an entire leg on the other end. Like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that this thing isn't doing that. I wondered if they are helpers, or indeed if this is the helper for some other folks. So the first muscle that came to my mind was Magnus, adductor Magnus, right? Again, referencing my interpretation of myokin, in ischiocondylar adductor Magnus is the primary driver for femoral plane control, i.e. hip joint adduction. Well, the other part of it, the linea aspera part of Magnus, was something that had intrigued me once I started thinking about what the hell is AFIR. So if we look at the force vector, or vector of pull for this thing, it's not a very clean form of adduction, right? There are some transverse plane elements to this, right? One. Number two, because it connects to the back of the femur, it will externally rotate the femur as well. All that at the same time, because it connects to the ischium into the pubis. When this thing contracts by itself, I can absolutely see how this thing would put the pelvis into anterior tilt, right? But obviously that will be a pretty rare phenomenon to happen by itself. But nevertheless, this is for the sake of analysis. So if we look at that, and that together, then it makes a lot more sense that if we get sagittal plane with the ischial tuberosity being pulled down and the pelvis secured and stabilized in the sagittal plane. Now, everybody imagine obliques. I'm just too lazy to pull all that shit up right now. So, nevertheless, the innominate is now stabilized in the sagittal plane. Two very important things happen. First of all, the adductor loses its ability to anterior tilt the pelvis. Now, look at these babies. They're strong. You are probably not going to overpower them if you're just a little old adductor, at least not in the sagittal plane. At the same time, because you are loading the skeleton in closed chain, as well as the hamstring's ability to stabilize or control a tibia, you're probably also not going to externally rotate this femur that has 100 plus pounds on top of it. Therefore, the only way this thing is going to go down is the outlet being pulled towards the femur, with very, very likely some transverse plane element to this. But nevertheless, you look at this thing, transverse plane force vector, not very aggressive, right? So if we get out of this and we take a look at longus, right? Longus has a much more aggressive force vector for transverse plane, right? So if this, looking at the architectural features of longus, it very much mimics Magnus in some ways. What I mean by that is, by itself, it can very easily put the pelvis into anterior tilt and externally rotate the femur because it also connects to the back of the femur. But with sagittal plane and frontal plane stabilized and controlled, this guy can only internally rotate the pelvis, right? So then I thought about, well, if there's one, there's probably more. It is the human body after all. So I did this. I did this. Now you have longus, brevis, pectineus, right? All these guys behaving very, very similarly in that by themselves, they would anteriorly tilt the pelvis and externally rotate the femur. But with sagittal plane and frontal plane controlled, they would internally rotate the pelvis in transverse plane. And I realized that these guys are the helpers. Actually, I would like to think for them to be the main drivers of internal rotation rather than anterior glute med. Again, this is my own views. I could be completely wrong. This is not reflecting what POI thinks. But nevertheless, I definitely agree that anterior glute med is a internal rotator, provided sagittal plane and frontal plane are controlled. Okay, so a lot of internal rotators, right? A lot of internal rotators, as well as iliacus here, operate by very much the same rules. Looking at the architectural feature of it, that with a unstable femur, the contraction of iliacus would externally rotate the femur. But if we control sagittal plane and frontal plane, it would internally rotate the pelvis instead. So with all of that being said, there's one thing I want to point everybody's attention to, and it is the configuration of the adductor groups, right? So all that shit about frontal plane and sagittal plane control aside, if we just look at the medial adductors, they're very linear, right? They're very vertical. In other words, making them very good candidates for frontal plane control. That being said, as we go towards the femur itself and higher towards the femoral head, they become much more transverse plane oriented, right? And it seems to correlate very, very well with our idea of getting frontal plane first so that you can get transverse plane. The body seems to like that too. Imagine that. So all that being said, that's a lot of internal rotators. Like most of the hip muscles become internal rotators when they all work together. In fact, to take a page out of Ron's playbook, really the quads are then internal rotators as well because they are helping to stabilize the force vectors created by everybody else. But taking that thing one step back, by themselves, quads are still external rotators, not very strong external rotators in terms of their force vector, but they still absolutely do it, right? And then there's glute, right? Glute max, certainly external rotation as well as posterior glute med. taking all that into consideration, not a lot of talent there. Not a lot of talent there. So, I mean, what happened to balance? That doesn't make sense, right? But if we take a step back and look at all of our clients and patients, and of course ourselves as well, no, almost pretty consistently, it is the excessive external rotation in our joints that gets us in trouble, one way or another. But why don't our bodies just fall into internal rotation? Like, why don't anybody get really excessive internal rotation for the most part, right? So I started thinking about that, and I realized it is gravity that is the ultimate external rotator. Because with every step we take and every jump that we land from, ground reaction forces, secondary to those activities, ground reaction forces travel through up and through our skeleton. Now, energy, in this case, in the form of vibration and kinetic energy, are always going to seek to fill the container that they're in. So in the form of kinetic energy, ground reaction forces coming back up to the body, they're going to try to expand within our skeletal system and muscular system, the body, the physical body. They're going to try to expand that, and that expansion is going to come in the form of external rotation. So I realized then evolution very likely gave us this very, very robust series of options for internally rotating our systems and compressing it so that we can manage the inherent decompression and expansion that's going to be coming from the ground, so that we can dictate when we're going to expand, at what place and at what time, so that we can manage this inherent threat from gravity. Now, this is not based on any research or anything like that. It's just my interpretation of what I think I'm seeing. I could be completely wrong, but these are my thoughts. Okay, that's it all for today. I hope everybody got something out of this. If you didn't, I'm sorry. No, I'm not. All right, folks. I will see you the next time I think of something useful.